Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be talking about karate and its effectiveness in combat sports as a self-defense system and all around as a fighting art. So let's get right into it. I'm going to say it. Karate sucks. But wait, does karate suck? Or is it the way that people train karate sucks? I think in order to answer this question, we need to kind of define what is karate in this context, what we identify karate as in the modern day and age. So, without going into the detail of the different styles and different schools, I've come up with this sort of a high-level overview about what karate is, right? So, we have the art form, we have the sport, and then we have something that's a bit more full contact or combat orientated, right? So let's call it the combat art of karate, the sport of karate, and then the traditional art of karate. And then when we look at those 3 points, we can further break it down. Okay, so let's kind of start with the art of karate. The art form of karate, regardless of the many styles, and I know there are dozens and dozens of styles in schools and grandmasters, but fundamentally we can go back to the root and say there's 2 schools of karate: the traditional Okinawan school of karate and the traditional Japanese school of karate, which technically was the modernization of karate when it came to Japan. So these are the 2 traditional original schools of karate. And yes, some karate expert out there may go back and say karate originates from China, X, Y, and Z, but that's not really necessary to get in that detail for this video, right? So point number 1, if we're looking at traditional karate, the Okinawan style of karate and the Japanese style of karate. Okinawan style of karate we'd find is a lot more simpler in terms of the stances are but more natural, and there was a lot of close combat techniques, things that require simple hand-to-hand joint manipulation, close range strikes. So the idea was, or the intention behind the art form traditionally, was close counter combat. However, it does not mean people necessarily trained for close counter combat. So traditional karate, what we find is people kind of go into the essence and the forms and the styles, and it's sort of a repetition of what has been passed down from instructor to student, from sensei to student to senpai, etc., whatever it is. So the traditional element, though it may appear to have some practical element to it, it's not necessarily effective as a combat system. And I'll tell you why. From my personal experience, right? And I'm just going to be honest here. For those of you who don't know, I actually trained in karate for many, many years. When I say many years, about maybe 14 years. And I competed in world championships. I got to the point of graduating for a 3rd degree black belt. But there was something that I noticed throughout my training. There was a split in the karate community. You get the very traditionalists and you get the very sport mind or sport focused karatekas or athletes, so to speak. Now the traditionalists per se, although we lay claim that a lot of the self-defense and combat techniques are derived from the traditional karate, from the forms or the katas, what I found was when I went to competitions or tournaments, those who were really focused on katas kind of stuck to that. They didn't get involved in the kumite or the fighting aspect of it, even though it was just point fighting. And I'm not saying that applied to everyone, but I'm saying those who were really passionate about the traditional aspect kind of focus on the forms and the traditional and the techniques. And then we find what we're training for something that's actually a bit more focused on karate versus karate aspect. We're focusing on something that's a bit more, it's unnatural in a way. It's everything, the stances are the same. Everyone, regardless, it doesn't take into consideration height, weight, and gender, whatever it is. So, I mean, it's not really practical, but it is an art form. Katas are beautiful. It keeps you fit, keeps you healthy. but it's not really effective in terms of a combat system or using it in an actual fight. Now, if that's how you, or people who train karate that way, focus more on the kata thing, I'm gonna say it quote unquote sucks in terms of it's not going to work in a fight. That's what I really mean. I'm not dissing kata here. I'm not saying kata is horrible or crap. I'm saying it's not going to work in a fight. Now, that is the traditional aspect. I'm just briefly touching on that. Let's kind of tip over into the Japanese karate of the traditional aspect. And there's kind of a mix of both, right? The Japanese karate, while I admit the Okinawan traditional style, traditional forms, and traditional techniques still resemble some actual combat techniques or applicable combat techniques. I'll admit that, like small joint manipulation, joint locks, things like that. The Japanese karate became more flowery, and it's more very disciplined, and everything's in line, and everyone's kind of treated expected to kind of fall in line and do the same thing, and the stances are a bit low. I know in the organization of specifically like JKA, the stances and the katas and the forms are very low, and it's not really practical, and the techniques are kind of practiced just for with the assumption that you're going to be defending against someone who is a karate fighter and not just a regular street fighter or someone with a different martial arts discipline. And that, from that, the traditional Japanese karate, I said that's when it kind of now we move on to the next point number 2, the sport karate. Okay, cool. So my first point was like, is karate, we kind of trying to address here, is karate actually effective as a combat system, right? And I think putting the traditional stuff aside, the way things are trained, we know that's not going to work. Now let's look at the sport. Sport is competitive. These are athletes. You got to be fit. You got to be in shape, and you got to be training regularly. And despite it being point fighting, at least in the early days or the older days, about 10-15 years ago, you could get hurt. I mean, in a karate fight. I know nowadays there's a lot more stricter rules about padding and gear, but when I started karate and we point fighting, we just use a 1-inch thick, what we call a boxing mitt or a karate mitt. It was white in color, and it looked like a bandage over your hands, and that's really all we had. There was no other protection with the exception of a mouth guard, and when we made contact, it would connect. Sometimes if you drew blood or if there was an injury, there would be a disqualification. It really depended where you were competing. Me personally, I came from South Africa. Living in South Africa, it was different. It was generally, we were used to sort of coming from a rough and tough environment, and karate is a sport. I mean, it wasn't necessarily not safe, but I'd say we did get hurt. But then I digress. Going back to the sport aspect of karate, right? So there's a lot of point fighting, there's a lot of techniques, a lot of karate versus karate technique. So that is the specific point I want to address. Karate is a sport. Is sport karate effective as a combat system? And again, it comes down to how do you train karate. If you are a karate athlete, and if you are a competitive karate athlete in the sport of karate, if you are training as karate versus karate, the techniques of a karate fighter against another karate fighter, it's unlikely that that's going to translate into an actual fight. And I'll tell you why. Have you seen what a point fight looks like? Essentially, the fight starts, and as soon as a blow is landed, a legal blow like a punch or kick above the waist, the fight stops. The point is declared to either the blue corner or the blue side or the red side, and then the fight continues. Now, this is bad for one of two reasons. One is because karate is considered semi-contact or light contact. Even though you have padding, you have to pull your punches. You have to hold back your punches, and that's kind of the problem. Training for sort of always holding back, and you never know when to really fully engage, because you're never going to really, you're going to be accustomed to that style of fighting, right? Point number 2, if you are adopting a style where it's a one hit, I mean, it needs to count. but you pull in your punches. And in the real fight, you don't just stop. If you're kind of used to the fight being stopped every time you land a punch, it kind of becomes habitual. And I actually experienced this firsthand. So when I eventually started training in kickboxing, right, I found that the round was continuous. It was a continuous 2-minute round. And now I found, okay, cool, I landed a perfect roundhouse kick, or what they call a Muay, but the fight doesn't stop there. You need to continue. So it's a different type of conditioning, it's a different type of body mechanics, and also you kind of need to now sort of pace yourself. You need to know when to execute your best technique and when to sort of, just weather the storm. It's a different ball game altogether. That's point number 2 of sport karate, specifically the point karate. Is one is you're holding your punches, and 2 is the fight is continuously stopping, and real fights don't stop. Whether it's MMA, whether it's in the street, a real fight, it's gonna stop when someone hits the ground and is unconscious, or someone else intervenes and stops the fight. Literally, that's how a fight stops. But in karate, sport karate, one is you're training against people with they're just defending against what they call a Muay or Gyakuzugi, like a reverse punch or cross punch. It's not practical. Having said that, though, I have to give some credit to sport karate point fighting, because the athletes or the fighters or the players who compete in point form are actually in good shape. They're very flexible and they're very quick. Now, there are some good points that of point fighting or sport karate. There's some good habits or techniques that can translate into a combat system, provided you are training in the right environment, but I'll get to that point a bit later. I just want to clarify these 2 points, why sport karate as individually as itself is not necessarily going to be effective in a fight. Now there's the someone may ask, what about full contact Kyokushin? Again, brilliant conditioning, hardening of the body, hardening of the knuckles. However, and I'm going to say it if you don't know it already, the blows to the face are illegal, and that's kind of the problem. That's kind of a huge problem. I mean, there was a famous fight on YouTube online, labeled a karate fighter versus Muay Thai fighter, and when he took a single blow to the face, he stopped fighting. And whether that was a lethal blow or not, that's just what he was trained to do. He was trained to stop when someone hits him in the face, because it's considered illegal. And if you look at that fight, I mean, it wasn't even that. It didn't look like a lethal blow. It looked like a regular punch in a fight. But sometimes are thrown in bunches or dozens in a regular fight. But his training and his conditioning of training to fight other karate fighters and training to fight people with a similar style and body mechanics, it's kind of developed. It's habitual. It's instinctive now. The fight needs to stop. I got punched in the face, and it's like this guy was traumatized. He couldn't continue. So full contact Kyokushin karate, yes, sure. But I mean, you don't know how to defend your face. You don't know how to defend a blow to the face. That's going to be a big problem. Now, the last point I kind of brought up, I spoke about combat karate, or karate as a combat system, and that's the type of karate we see in modern professional combat sports, in specifically like in the UFC and MMA. And recently there's been a promotion called Karate Combat, where it's full contact and it kind of resembles more a bit of kickboxing. Now, karate trained for MMA or karate trained for full contact system, perhaps it can be effective. You make the necessary adjustments. When I say necessary adjustments, I mean we need to look at the basics. We need to look at, you're going to have to learn to protect your face. Number one, you're going to have to strike someone else's face. If you are competing in MMA, or if you are looking at karate from the perspective of it being a combat system, that's just how it is. That's just how fighting works. When two people fight and they don't like each other, or when two people fight and they're competing against each other, they are going to punch each other in the face. So that's number one. There needs to be necessary adjustments. And then it needs to be flexibility with the techniques. So it means breaking away from traditional forms and the traditional design, what we think karate is, and trying to sort of troubleshoot and apply those techniques in an actual fight. So that's when it addresses my initial point or the question that I asked: does karate suck, or is it the way that people train karate which sucks? So when we're looking at karate as a combat system, if it's trained like any other full contact martial art, boxing or wrestling or MMA, or against live resistance, not a dummy, not a robot, but live resistance against a real human being who can punch and kick, who can come in at you from all angles, and perhaps karate can most definitely be effective. And we've seen this with the likes of Lyoto Machida, Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, and there are a few names there. Now, some may argue and say these are elite athletes, this is what they're trained to do, but look, traditionally, or the base they come from is karate. Now, going back to point number 2, when I spoke about sport karate, and I said some good points, they can actually translate into full contact. So, number 1, karate fighters are good, or from my experience when I did point fighting, something we learned to do well was closing the distance in a short period of time. So closing the distance, darting in and out, and striking when your opponent counter strike, sort of getting out of the line of fire, and doing that effectively and consistently, because it can be frustrating for your opponent. Also, it kind of avoids damage to a degree. So the idea is you time your shots well, you time your opponent's movement, you kind of what they call is like maybe like taisabaki, or they're breaking the line, and it's footwork, move, dart in, strike, dart out, avoid the counter punch. And that is something that can actually work. It's been proven by the likes of Lyoto Machida, and it can work, right? So that's the one thing. The other thing is with karate is that, I found that out of all the martial arts I trained, my body was most flexible when I train karate. It's the flexibility and the functional movement. And it sounds kind of like contradictory, right? But all the exercise you do in kata, and all the exercise you do in karate, and all the warm-ups, depending on your school or your dojo, but for me personally, it kind of aligned to the system of karate or fighting and the body mechanics. So learning to understand body mechanics, and that's another good positive point. They can come from sport karate and perhaps traditional karate, right? So how should we, or you, or anyone train karate if they want to see it, or want to test it as being effective, right? Point number 1, I did say you gotta train and train against live resistance. That means a lot of sparring, a lot of experimentation, a lot of sparring. If it's not gonna work against a live human being who's not a robot, who's not told to just do 1, 2, and 3, who can do 5 and 6, and perhaps it's not gonna work in a fight, or the chances are slim. What it really comes down to is placing yourself in unfamiliar situations. So whether it's sparring with a kickboxer, or sparring 3-minute or 2-minute rounds in a kickboxing rule set, or doing MMA sparring, and applying those techniques, learning to adjust your footwork, learning to adjust your stances, understanding when to keep your hands up and when to drop your hands, understanding how to pace your shots. So when you dart in and you use that initial strike, and then the fight's not going to stop. So understanding how to get out how to continue fighting, how to continuously pose a threat or defend, and that's only going to come with constant sparring and say sparring, continuous sparring, and experimentation. So you find that you may find like a lot of your kicks may work, like a side thrust kick or spinning heel kick. You may find that some of the punches aren't working for me, like a backhand snap snap fist, it's not going to work. But perhaps if I do a full rotation, like a 360 rotation of a backhand, maybe that will work. You find it, okay, find the blocks, the traditional blocks aren't really blocks in that sense, but in a grappling exchange, perhaps the blocks are more good grip breaks, which literally, if you've trained in like judo or Brazilian jiu-jitsu, you'd find that like that some of those the grip breaks resemble traditional karate blocks, which again ties into the Okinawan karate with the close counter combat, right? So if is karate effective? Again, it can be effective. It depends on you as an individual. Do you want it to be effective? Then make it work. But you gotta break away from all the traditional mess. When I say traditional mess, the mind control culture of no, listen to your sensei and stick to your dojo and do one thing. You have to broaden your horizons. You have to expose yourself and be vulnerable in the sense that put yourself in unfamiliar situations and spar as many people you can. Obviously, in a controlled, safe environment, in an official gym. You don't have to compete in MMA. You don't have to go and fight in the streets. But it's important to train against live resistance. If you're not training against live resistance, forget karate ever being effective. Forget it. Anything. Heck, if you're not doing live resistance for any martial art, it's never going to be effective. So that's kind of my little breakdown about what is karate and is it actually effective as a combat system. And to conclude, really, again, karate probably only sucks if you're not training for a particular purpose in mind. And I've said this before. I've said this for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in a previous video. It all comes down to what are you training for and how are you training for it. If you want to be able to use your karate in a real life situation, you got to be training for that. And if you want to be using your karate for fitness and mastering forms and getting into the whole history and the traditional side of it, then sure, that's cool too. But you need to understand that that is not necessarily relevant to actual hand-to-hand combat. At least not in this day and age. So there you have it, guys. That's my little breakdown about karate and its effectiveness as a combat system. Hope you liked this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and all those things that people say in every other YouTube video. Same here. Like, subscribe. See you next time. Bye.